Welcome to the Depth Dive. Today we're jumping into some really fascinating research material that one of you actually sent over.
Yeah, it's all about understanding something pretty fundamental in AI models,
Yeah.
these token and CLS embeddings in attention mechanisms.
Exactly. How do they actually, learn during training? That's the core question. We're going to unpack let's say, the academic side of things, the theory, and some really neat findings presented here.
Right. We're looking at how structure emerges in these embeddings and how that structure connects back to the data itself, like the raw statistics.
And the main way we'll explore this, following the source, is through a simplified model, just one layer of softmax attention.
Yeah.
But it reveals a lot.
Okay, yeah. Let's set the scene a bit. Token embeddings are everywhere, right? In models you use daily, ChatGPT, Claude, even things like AlphaFold. They're basically numerical representations of words or subwords.
Absolutely critical building blocks. But here's the thing the paper points out. Despite how much we use them, the theory behind how they get trained, how they pick up meaning, it's actually been a bit, underexplored.
Yeah, or often simplified in previous theoretical work. So this research really tries to tackle that head on.
And they do it by focusing on this specific setup, that one-layer attention model, doing binary classification. Think positive or negative sentiment, that kind of thing.
So you've got your token embeddings, let's call that matrix E. These are for the individual words or tokens in the sequence. Then you have the special Azios token embedding, P. Often, its job is to kind of aggregate information from the whole sequence.
Right, like a summary embedding. And there's also an output vector, via Z, which helps map everything to the final decision, positive or negative.
And the training itself, pretty standard stuff.
Yeah.
Minimize the logistic loss using gradient descent. Or for the theory, they often analyze the continuous version, gradient flow, which makes the math a bit more tractable.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning, like the very first step of training. What happens immediately?
This is one of the first interesting takeaways. The paper looks at just one single gradient step on the initial, maybe random token embeddings, E. And even after just that one step, those embeddings already start to reflect token importance.
Really? How?
Well, the embedding for a specific token, say ESAS, starts to align itself with that output vector V. And the amount it aligns is proportional to how statistically relevant that token is.
And how do they measure relevance?
They use something called ASK, the average sign frequency. Basically, it measures how often a token appears with a positive label versus a negative label.
Ah, okay. So if a word like excellent appears way more in positive examples, its S is high and positive.
Exactly. And a word like awful would have a negative S. If a word appears equally in both or is just rare, its S is near zero.
So after one tiny update, the embedding for excellent gets nudged towards the positive direction defined by V, and awful gets nudged towards the negative just based on these simple counts.
Precisely. That statistical signal gets imprinted almost instantly. It's the basic but fundamental starting point.
Okay, that makes sense for the individual token embeddings initially. Now let's dive into the cell-say embedding, PP. This seems to be where a lot of the deeper theoretical work in the paper lies.
Definitely. They focus on its training using gradient flow, assuming the token embeddings E have already taken that first statistical step we just talked about.
And you mentioned this is where some of the real academic innovation comes in.
Yeah. A key point is that unlike some previous work, which might show convergence only if you start near the solution or their specific assumptions, this research aims to characterize all the possible directions the cell-to embedding could eventually point towards.
That sounds ambitious. Not just a solution, but the whole space of possibilities.
Exactly. And the first thing they find analytically is kind of surprising. The norm, like the length or magnitude of this cell-to vector P, it just keeps growing.
Growing to infinity.
Yeah, it diverges. There are no finite norm points where the gradient is zero, no stable resting place in terms of size.
So does that mean it breaks? Or that training is unstable?
Not quite. It's a feature of the optimization landscape for this kind of model. While the magnitude blows up, the direction of the vector P can still converge. It can settle into pointing consistently in one direction.
Okay, I see. The length goes wild, but the direction can stabilize. And that direction is what matters for attention, right?
Yeah, exactly. The direction determines which token embeddings it has the highest dot product with, which tokens it attends to most strongly.
So if the direction does converge, let's call the limiting direction P phi, what does the theory say about which direction it chooses?
This is the core of Theorem 4.3. Under their simplifying assumption about tokens being clearly positive or negative, If P converges in direction, that direction P must be one that selects all the truly important tokens.
Selects meaning. It has the highest dot product with the embeddings of those important tokens.
Precisely. The cell's embedding learns to point in a direction that maximizes its alignment with the embeddings of the tokens that are most statistically indicative of the correct class.
And it's not just any direction that happens to pick out those tokens, is it? There's more mathematical structure.
Right. This is another key theoretical contribution. They proved this limiting direction is actually a max margin direction for the set of selected tokens.
Max margin. Okay, that sounds like concepts from support vector machines, finding the biggest separation.
That's the intuition, exactly. The gradient flow process implicitly drives the E-cell embedding team to solve an optimization problem. It finds the direction that maximizes the margin, the separation based on dot products between the embeddings of the important tokens it selects and the embeddings of the tokens it doesn't select.
Wow. So while its length is exploding, the sales token is learning this optimal separating direction in the embedding space, specifically to isolate the most informative tokens.
That's the theoretical punchline. And academically, this is quite significant because, as they point out, previous studies often showed convergence to locally optimal max margin solutions, maybe requiring specific starting points. This work characterizes all potential convergence directions as having this global max margin property relative to the selected set, which is a stronger, more general result.
That feels like a really solid piece of theoretical understanding going beyond just finding a possible outcome.
Okay, but what about the irrelevant tokens? Does P only select the important ones, or can it get confused? Good question. They look into that too. First, Lemma 4.4 shows that the limiting direction P cannot select all tokens in the vocabulary.
Okay, so it has to ignore some tokens.
Right. And since the theory says it must select all the important ones, under their assumption, it logically follows that it must exclude at least some of the irrelevant ones.
Fine, it excludes some, but could it still accidentally lump in a few irrelevant tokens along with the truly important ones?
That's addressed in Lemma 4.5. They add another condition here. It basically assumes that the clean max margin solution, the one selecting only the important tokens, actually achieves a better margin, a wider separation, than any solution that tries to include some irrelevant tokens.
Makes sense. If the important tokens provide a clearer signal.
Exactly. And if that condition holds, and if the embedding dimension D is large enough,
Enough space for separation.
right, then they prove the limiting direction pill will indeed select only the important tokens and exclude all the irrelevant ones.
So with a clear signal and enough dimensions, the psyche embedding becomes this perfect filter, learning to focus attention solely on the statistically vital parts of the input based on this max margin principle.
That's the theoretical picture, yeah. It becomes highly specialized.
This is all very elegant theoretically, but does it hold up? Did they test it?
They did run numerical experiments, which is crucial. They used synthetic data where they could control the properties precisely, and also real-world text data IMDB movie reviews, Yelp reviews.
Okay. And did they just test the simple one-layer model from the theory?
They tested that, yes, but they also, importantly, tested a slightly more complex two-layer transformer model.
Ah, good. So what did the plots show? Did the experiments match the theory?
They showed really strong alignment. If you look at their plots, particularly figures 2 and 3 for the one-layer model,
Okay.
they plot the dot products.
Okay.
The dot product between a trained token embedding xe and the output vector v that shows a clear linear relationship with the signed frequency, that os value, positive tokens align positively, negative ones negatively.
Right, matching that very first gradient step theory.
Exactly. But then the dot product between the token embedding xe and the trained self embedding p, that shows a different shape. It looks like a U or a V.
A U shape, meaning
tokens that are strongly positive or strongly negative tokens with a large absolute value of OSPQuest have a high dot product. With P tokens near the middle, the less decisive ones have a low dot product.
Ah, so V cares about the direction of importance, positive versus negative, but P cares about the strength of importance, regardless of direction. It selects the tokens with the strongest signal.
Precisely that. It visually confirms the theory. V captures the signed frequency, while P aligns with the magnitude of that frequency, effectively implementing that max margin selection of the most salient tokens.
And you said they saw this in the two-layer model, too.
Yes. Figure 1 shows results for the two-layer transformer on the real datasets. And remarkably, the same qualitative pattern appears. The dot products show the same relationships.
Wow. So even though the theory was built for the simpler model, the actual behavior, the way these embeddings learn about importance, seems to carry over to a more complex architecture.
It suggests the core principles identified might have broader applicability, which is quite exciting.
Okay, so let's try to summarize the key takeaways here. This research really digs into how gradient descent shapes these embeddings.
Yeah, it gives us two main theoretical insights. First, that very initial step where token embeddings immediately start reflecting sign statistical importance by aligning with the output vector.
And second, the more complex story of the dull size embedding, where its direction converges towards a specific kind of solution, a max margin direction, that selects the most statistically important tokens based on magnitude.
And the real academic step forward seems to be characterizing this dulce convergence comprehensively, showing all roads lead to this type of max margin solution for the selected tokens, not just some specific paths.
Right, moving beyond local results or needing special initializations, and the experiments back this up, showing these patterns even in a slightly deeper model. Now, the authors are also upfront about limitations, right? This picture is mostly based on these first-order stats, like frequencies.
Exactly. It doesn't fully capture everything models learn, especially in deeper networks. Things like, causal relationships between tokens or the kind of sequential reasoning associated with induction heads that other researchers found. This theory doesn't quite explain that yet.
Okay.
And that leads them to propose a kind of conjecture, a direction for future work.
Which is?
Maybe in deeper transformers, there's a kind of division of labor. Perhaps the earlier layers are busy learning that complex structure, the causal links, the sequence pattern,
Well, the later layers.
while the later layers might be doing something closer to what this paper analyzes.
Yeah.
Performing classification or making decisions based more on these overall statistical properties, identifying the most salient features based on learned importance.
That's a really neat idea. Different layers specializing in different kinds of reasoning. So, thinking about all this, if the embeddings and the attention focus, especially in later layers perhaps, are so heavily influenced by the raw statistical properties of the data, what does that suggest to you, for the listener maybe to ponder? What might it imply about the capabilities or maybe the inherent biases baked into these huge models trained on messy, real-world internet data?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? If the core mechanism partly relies on identifying statistical saliency, how does that interact with the biases present in the vast data sets they learn from? Definitely something to chew on.